Malzeno, the flagship monster for Monster Hunter Rise's Sunbreak, is certainly a beast contrary to what I was expecting from the game's first expansion, in that it's not a creature inspired by Japanese yokai myth, but instead something altogether more Western. I don't think many would contest that the obvious inspiration for our latest flagship Elder Dragon is the vampire, the European blood-drinking undead that is both one of the best-known and hideously misidentified supernatural of modern times, alongside Dr. Frankenstein's monster, of course. Vampire as a whole covers a whole suite of creatures from across the world united by one or two core traits, namely that they're sanguivores, who must consume the blood of human beings to survive. Some vampiric supernaturals are living creatures, but the vast majority are former humans who have risen from the grave to once more haunt the world. I can guarantee that you can go to any continent historically inhabited by man, and you'll find some manner of blood-drinking undead. The trope and varieties of the creature are so very ubiquitous. In this video, we're going to look at how vampires and vampiric lore has inspired and informed the design aspects of Malzeno. But first we need to ask ourselves, what is a vampire? Because the image that first pops into your head is most likely completely unrecognisable to the vast majority of your ancestors who knew the word. As I said in the introduction, when the average person imagines a vampire, certainly in the West, we pretty much all have the same image in our head of a seductive, pale-skinned creature that slinks through the night and instantly vaporises the moment it so much as gets a whiff of sunlight. Additional points if they are actually souls that are constantly tortured by the nature of their existence and ask nightly questions about the reasons for their persistence and the troubles of their condition, even as they enjoy life's pleasures and fall for some mortal woman with almost tiresome and obsessive certainty. However, the truth behind vampires is a lot more varied than the stereotypical creature of the night popularised by the last 125 years. Vampiric creatures that drain the blood of the living are ubiquitous across the world. In West Africa there is the Asam-bosam, which hangs upside down from trees and bites your head off to drink your blood. In Australia we have the Namorodo, a desiccated undead that drains the moisture from the bodies of the living to create more of their kind, and prefer to consume the freshness of children. In the New World we have the Puchen of Chile, a shape-shifting winged serpent that may or may not be the myth-sized and dramatised version of the infamous real-world vampire bat, alongside the more famous Chupacabra as well. However, in terms of sheer variety and number, perhaps no part of the world has as many vampires as Eastern Europe, from where we get the actual word for vampire in the English language. Here, vampires rise from the dead for various reasons, and from then on terrorise the living, draining of blood first those they knew well in life, and even siring half-human dhampir children by the woman they desired. Such creatures are known as strigoi mort, although often thought of and reimagined simply as strigoi in most modern popular culture. The conditions that can lead to one being reborn as a strigoi are numerous and range from the supernatural, such as being the seventh child of the same sex born to a family, to the religious, such as living a life of sin, to the bizarre. If you are a child born with a 1 in 80,000 chance of being born with a caul, which is a sort of amniotic membrane that can cover a newborn's head. Even being unmarried at the time of one's death, being executed, or if you died via suicide is enough to rise again as a vampire. Frankly, with these conditions, any dark fantasy featuring vampires should mention Eastern Europe being swiftly consumed by a tidal wave of the undead with the sheer number of them that should occur. However, from these traditional versions of vampires, one might wonder just how we have the creature that we do today. Because, let's face it, the description of a strigoi doesn't really match up with the current pop cultural image of a vampire, right? Well, the entire archetype of the vampire in the West is pretty much due to the cultural impact of Dracula, a novel by Bram Stoker, published in 1897. Stoker rather created his own beast from multiple legends when he made the eponymous character of his most famous work. I highly suspect that many of Malzeno's traits derive from the Dracula interpretation of vampires rather than the more traditional strigoi, although seeing how Stoker took many traits of the Strigoi and others, hopefully my early explanation will serve to add to the description and explanation behind the creature. Stoker's vampires presented almost as an unholy plague upon humanity that seemingly only seeks to dominate mankind and spread its undead state to others. Count Dracula is no glamorous blood-drinking bad boy of modern literature. When he is first met by the character of Jonathan Harker, he has a very distinctive and frankly somewhat unpleasant description, with the Englishman making note of his sharp teeth and nails. Dracula thinks the glories of the past, including his empty castle devoid of servants and filled with past glories. There's even a multi-page rant he goes on about his boyar history and its significance to him. The character of Count Dracula himself possesses a wide range of strange abilities that cannot be explained conventionally. Among other things, he can transform into mist, command and transform into hounds, wolves and bats, possesses the strength of 20 men, and can even scale vertical walls by crawling in a manner not unlike a lizard, and even create localized weather patterns of all things. This is in addition to telepathy and hypnotic abilities over those he has bitten and fed his blood to. There's basically an entire chapter of the book dedicated to expositing the Count's powers for the sake of the characters and the reader. There's also a lot of vampiric lore in Dracula that was not carried across to future fiction, such as the inability to cross running water at the slack tide, or the fact he doesn't actually die when he's hit by sunlight. He simply gains the strength and powers of a normal being. In-game, Malzeno has a body that's very clearly not the stereotypical vampire. The furthest thing from it, really. Instead, it has the body of a dragon. Some comment could be made here about how Dracula's real-life inspiration, Vlad Tepes III, took the name that quite literally means son of the dragon, or son of Dracul, in homage to his father, Vlad II Dracul, who himself gained it from the Order of the Dragon. This chivalric order of knights was founded by Sigismund of Luxembourg, who at the time was King of Hungary, but who would later go on to be the Holy Roman Emperor. The order was founded for the purpose of fighting off the Ottoman Turks, who at the time were a great threat to Eastern Europe and Christendom in general. Whether this is incidental coincidence, I cannot comment on. All of the released concept art for Malzeno definitely presents a draconic creature, so it seems to have been a design intention from the start. But the Elder Dragon class of monsters is almost purely dragons, despite its classification of including other strange things. In terms of individual design elements, the main feature that perhaps comes to mind when one pictures a vampire is grandeur and refinement, and Malzeno was apparently designed with such considerations in mind, even if in the video that said so there was actually no examples given, annoyingly enough. From its upright posture that might call to mind the pose of a toffee-nosed aristocrat, to the assemblage of curio on the monster's neck and chest that looks like a cravat, many elements of stereotypically aristocratic features are here. For those that do not know, the cravat is an early precursor to the modern tie, although the term is still used for what is now sometimes referred to as an ascot. In the Georgian era, the skill and style with which a man would tie his cravat would say a lot about his taste and refinement, not to mention the actual quality and worth of the article itself. Interestingly, the character of Dracula from the Castlevania series is often portrayed with this most dapper of items, although the actual period of the cravat's fashion was decidedly falling off by the time that the novel Dracula was actually published. As a final note on design, the dark red wings of Malzeno, with their somewhat tattered-looking edges, might be a further callback to the design of the stereotypical vampire dressed in a cape, although in truth the cape was only really introduced in the 1931 Bela Lugosi film of Dracula. Before that, he mostly wore a suit. It would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that Malzeno possesses the most apparent of features of the stereotypical vampire, at least in body, the fangs. Whilst it has a full complement of teeth, the monster has a pair of oversized bony protuberances on the upper jaw that likely don't classify as true fangs but perform a similar function. In the monster's intro, we can clearly see it holding its prey by the neck, the location that vampires are said to prefer to drain their victims from. Whether they actually pierce the hide in the manner of a carnivore's cranio-cervical bite, or These fangs are to enhance Malzeno's ability to grip their prey. It seems fair to assume that they are not being used to directly consume the blood of the Rathalos, seeing Malzeno's dependence on the curio for that purpose. Rather notably, in older concept art from Malzeno, these fangs were even more pronounced, just to really hammer home the image. Having mentioned fangs and their supposed use in draining blood, Malzeno certainly has a strong association with the substance of life. I mean, the creature's rage mode is damn well called the Bloodening, a title that I really feel could have been far more imaginative. The Bloodening sounds like a really bad horror movie that is swiftly forgotten to me. They could have at least called it Sanguine Mode, or go all out in typical Capcom fashion and called it Blood Hunter or the Silver Duke's Fury, or something along those lines. Names aside, Malzeno is not actually a traditional vampire as far as we know, because it does not directly consume the blood of other beings. Instead, it relies on the bat-like curio creatures that often accompany and rest on its body to do so instead. These strange little flying lampreys are said to feed on life force, although frankly in many cultures, and notably in the East, the concept of life force and blood are practically interchangeable. There is a reason why we have the word lifeblood, after all. The Curio return to Malzeno and in some way give this life force back to the Elder Dragon, presumably through biting and vomiting it back up? To be honest, Monster Hunter has increasingly been introducing notions of bioenergy and now life force as well, so I cannot comment on exactly how this process works. But when we boil it down, Malzeno feeds on the life force of other beings, even if it's through an intermediary. The fact the Curio at first appear to be bats is also a callback to the historic association of bats with vampires, as far back as the Eastern European Strigoi. Stoker's Dracula as well could transform into a bat, and in pop culture, of course, we have numerous instances, too many to count really, of vampires transforming or having the physical traits derived from bats. Interestingly, Malzeno can even inflict a sort of vampirism on the hunter themselves in the form of blood blight, which decreases natural healing effects from items, and steadily reduces health but lets you heal by attacking monsters. Much like the vampire, you must now draw the blood of living beings to remain healthy, and like the undead, your ability to restore yourself is compromised greatly. And thus we have it, Malzeno, our Prince of the Night and the monster's inspiration and bases on the vampiric mythology of Eastern Europe. To be quite honest, I'm not much of a fan of Malzeno. I always felt that Monster Hunter had a bit of a dragon problem with its elder dragons, as odd as it sounds. By this I mean that rather than having an elder dragon, which historically has included such oddities as the earthquake whale, the walking volcano, and the octopus hot air balloon, we've had far too many monsters that end up being standard draconic body with X gimmick. Be it dragon but a necromancer, dragon but it's a rocket, dragon that might be an alien but then becomes nuclear smaug. Malzeno feels far more like a dragon that is a vampire rather than a monster that is inspired by a vampire. Whilst I appreciate that the design team has to literally make a monster from the mesh and animations up, I feel like it's a wasted opportunity, to be frank. Malzeno could have been a gigantic mosquito-like Neopteron, a large lamprey-like snake wyvern, or a fanged beast inspired by the literal vampire bat, and I cannot help but escape the conclusion that Malzeno was a waste of a good concept. However, that's just my opinion. So what do you think? Is Malzeno an instant hit and monster you really want to see in the future? Do you think its various design inspirations were well done, or would you rather have seen something more heavily derived from other vampiric animals? Either way, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.